Imagine waking up one random morning, grabbing your coffee, and checking the news just to find out that one single ship, yeah, just one, has managed to paralyze global trade. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's exactly what happened in March of the year 2021, when the Evergreen, one of the biggest container ships ever built, got wedged sideways across the Suez Canal. Suddenly, the narrow artery that carries almost 15% of all global trade wasn't moving, and the world had an unexpected heart attack. Now, if you think this sounds like some maritime comedy, think again. This was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. Hundreds of ships lined up on both sides of the canal waiting for passage, carrying everything from oil and cars to coffee and electronic components. Do you know what happens when those ships don't move? Prices jump, delivery times explode, and factories on the other side of the world start wondering where their parts are. It's like when your internet goes down, but instead of losing a Netflix episode, the whole economy loses billions. The funny part, if you can call it that, is how fragile the whole thing proved to be. A single gust of wind, a few degrees off course, and bam, trade between Europe and Asia grinds to a halt. That's the power and the curse of efficiency. For decades, the global economy has optimized every route, every container, every second, squeezing out waste and cost. But efficiency is like walking on a tightrope. Amazing when it works, disastrous when something shakes it. So, let's talk about why the Evergreen wasn't just a ship. It was a warning signal. You see, the Suez Canal isn't new. It has been moving ships since the 19th century, and wars have been fought over who controls it. It's one of those geographical choke points that keep the modern world running. Cut that artery, even for a few days, and you cause more disruption than most countries' entire annual GDPs. Not bad for one ship stuck in the mud. What makes this story even more revealing is how fast everything started to break down. Within 24 hours, global oil prices bounced upward. Within 48 hours, European ports began running capacity warnings. Within 72 hours, major manufacturing firms in Japan, Germany, and the United States announced impending delays. All this because a boat longer than the Empire State Building was doing the world's most expensive sideways drift. You might be wondering, okay, but how does that affect me? I'm not shipping cars through Egypt. Well, remember that the global economy is like a spider web. You can't pull one thread without shaking the rest. That delay in deliveries meant fewer cars on lots, higher costs for components, and even temporary shortages in things like microchips. Those microchips? They go into the laptop you're probably watching this on. So yeah, it did affect you. Let's make it more concrete. Imagine you're running a small electronics store in London or New York. Normally, your stock travels smoothly from Asian suppliers to your shelf in a matter of weeks. Suddenly, your shipment is trapped in the middle of nowhere behind a giant monument of floating steel. You're paying rent, taxes, salaries, everything. But your products are sitting under the desert sun because of a bad Tuesday on the canal. That's how global dependence works. It's invisible until it breaks. And here's something even crazier. The ship wasn't even damaged. The Evergreen itself came out of the incident almost intact. The real damage was economic, psychological, and systemic. Because when something as seemingly random as a stuck ship can cost the world economy $9 billion per day, the illusion of control starts crumbling. The true revelation wasn't that trade could stop. It was that it could stop so easily. But let's zoom out a little. The Evergreen represents something bigger. The limits of globalization's promise of endless flow. For decades, companies built supply chains that crossed oceans multiple times before a product reached the consumer. Why? Because it was cheaper, at least on paper. Production in Vietnam, parts from China, final assembly in Germany, and distribution in the IT looked smart, until a single boat reminded everyone that the shortest line between 2 points can still be blocked. Now here's the kicker. The shipping industry is full of ever-givens. There are more than 20,000 container ships floating around the world at any given time, each one a microcosm of global capitalism, moving goods valued in the trillions. Yet, the same industry runs on razor-thin margins, outdated infrastructure, and insane schedules. Every single day is a bet that nothing will go wrong, and sometimes, like in 2021, that bet collapses. What few people realized in the moment was that the Suez blockage was less about bad luck and more about systemic vulnerability. When efficiency becomes the holy grail, redundancy disappears. Think of it like this. If you only keep one charger for your phone because you hate clutter, what happens when it breaks? You're disconnected. That's basically the global trade system right now. Optimized to perfection, but allergic to disruption. We can even call this the brittleness paradox. The more smoothly something runs, the less prepared it is to crash. Airlines, financial systems, supply chains, they all share this DNA. The Ever Given made the world see that perfection and fragility are two sides of the same coin. You either build for speed or for resilience, but trying to have both usually means having neither. Another fascinating element here was how quickly memes and viral posts spread. Remember the image of the tiny excavator trying to dig out the giant ship? That became a symbol of human proportion in the age of global scale. A single worker trying to move what entire economies couldn't. Funny, absolutely. Symbolic? More than you can imagine. It embodied humanity's relationship with its own machines. Powerful, yet dependent. Massive, yet delicate. Now you'd expect the world to learn from that, right? To rethink logistics, to add more safety nets, to diversify routes. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Not much changed. A few meetings, a few insurance adjustments, a few new crisis protocols. And then everyone went back to normal. Because in the world of global trade, time is literally money, and slowing down the machine is heresy. As long as the profits keep flowing, the risks stay ignored. Let's talk about the economics for a second. You've got what's called just-in-time production, a method invented to minimize inventory and storage costs. In plain English, it means products arrive exactly when needed, no sooner, no later. It works beautifully when everything goes right, but it collapses spectacularly when one cog stops turning. The Suez blockage was the ultimate test and failure of just-in-time logic on a global scale. Companies scrambled to reroute ships around the Cape of Good Hope, which added roughly 10 extra days to the journey. That's 10 more days of paying crews, fuel, and insurance. Multiply that by hundreds of ships, and you suddenly have a global bill taller than the Burj Khalifa. And here's the key lesson. When the invisible costs of disruption emerge, they expose how fake the illusion of cheap trade really was. Those low prices in your favorite online store? They exist thanks to an unbroken chain of miracles. The Ever Given also showed who really pays the price when things go wrong. Spoiler, it's not the mega corporations. It's the smaller businesses, the freelancers, the consumers, the ones without the power to hedge or defer losses. While big companies managed delays through credit and leverage, small operators faced bankruptcy because they couldn't afford to wait. That's the uncomfortable underbelly of globalization. It amplifies both prosperity and vulnerability, often for the same people. Now, there's another layer. Here's even more intriguing. The environmental one. Hundreds of ships idling for days means millions of extra tons of carbon emissions. Ironically, a traffic jam in the middle of the desert was polluting the planet. Add to that the fact that rerouting ships meant burning more fuel, and suddenly, your online shopping contributes to climate chaos in ways you'd never imagine. Every convenience hides a cost. Every click ripples across the ocean. But if you think this story ends in despair, hold on, because the Evergreen wasn't just a disaster. It was a mirror. It forced governments, corporations, and consumers to look at how entwined everything had become. For a brief week, everyone, from Wall Street to logistics hubs in Singapore, shared one thought. Maybe we've built something too big, too fast, and too fragile. And that's a rare moment of clarity in global economics. Still, instead of panic, there was something like awe. The world realized how much we depend on those massive steel boxes crossing oceans silently. Each one carries thousands of products, stories, and ambitions from one continent to another. A ship like that is basically a floating economy. And when it stops, it shows us what real interdependence looks like. The Evergreen turned the abstract idea of global trade into a picture anyone could understand. Stuck, struggling, and costing billions by the hour. And that's why this event belongs not just in the news, but in history. It wasn't a crisis born from greed or war, but from pure complexity. The kind of problem no single person can fix, yet everyone contributes to. The next time you order something online and see a delay, think of that ship, that canal, and the delicate dance between speed, cost, and chaos that keeps our world afloat. So, what have we learned before sailing into the next chapter? That the world can literally stop because one ship took a wrong turn. That efficiency has a hidden price tag. And that no matter how advanced our systems seem, they're still bound by physics, geography, and a bit of bad luck. The Evergreen didn't just block a canal, it exposed the thin line between modern prosperity and global paralysis. And trust me, this was just the beginning of how ships have shaped, and sometimes sunk, entire economies. You know the story. The Titanic, the unsinkable ship that sank. But here's the thing. Everyone focuses on the iceberg, the romance, the tragedy. Few people talk about what the Titanic really symbolized. Blind faith in progress and the unstoppable arrogance of an age that thought it had conquered. And guess what? That mindset didn't just sink a ship. It reshaped entire sectors of the global economy overnight, unveiling a pattern that still repeats itself today. Back in the early 1900s, the Titanic was more than a luxury liner. It was an ideological statement. The British Empire was at its peak. Industry was booming. Steel, engines, and electricity defined modernity. People believed they were living in the dawn of a new era, one where technology had finally defeated uncertainty. The Titanic was the crown jewel of this confidence, a floating city that promised not only wealth and comfort, but near immortality for those who could afford the ticket. Now, let's step into the shoes of the average Edwardian businessman. You've got booming trade routes, colonies bringing raw materials, and a middle class finally tasting prosperity. The economy felt unstoppable. And what did that do? It inflated egos and erased caution. The Titanic wasn't just seen as a ship. It was seen as proof that money and innovation could control itself. Efficiency, prestige, and luxury had merged into one glittering monument of human ego. But doesn't care about brand slogans. When the Titanic hit that iceberg on the night of April 14, 1912, the biggest ship ever built met the cold reality of physics. It tore open like a soda can. The world gasped, but what followed was not only a maritime disaster, it was a financial and psychological earthquake. The companies backing the ship faced catastrophic losses. The insurers, many of them located in London, had mispriced their risk spectacularly. The ripple reached banks, stockholders, and colonial trade firms depending on the safety of maritime logistics. What's fascinating is how the Titanic exposed flaws beyond steel and rivets. It revealed that an entire economic model had been running on faith rather than facts. The shipping industry of that time was obsessed with speed and prestige. Bigger ships, faster transits, more glamour. That was the metric of success. Sound familiar? It's the same logic behind modern giants that chase scale and dominance without considering fragility. When something becomes too big to fail, it usually means it's one shock away from disaster. There's something called the myth of unsinkability, and it applies far beyond ships. It's an illusion of control that emerges whenever humans believe they've mastered uncertainty. Banks had it before 2008. Tech companies had it before the dot-com bubble burst. And the Titanic had it before it met the Atlantic. The core error is thinking complexity equals safety, when in reality, it often multiplies the number of failure points. So, let's talk about the business side of this disaster. White Star Line, the company behind the Titanic, was competing in a brutal market. Its rivals Cunard and others were pushing faster, sleeker ships. In response, White Star aimed for size and luxury. The Titanic was a floating palace designed to attract the wealthy elite. But here's the catch. It was also a financial house of cards. Every voyage was meant to prove profitability to investors. Every small failure carried huge reputational cost. When it sank, the prestige economy around transatlantic travel sank with it. What followed was not just mourning, it was market correction. Insurance payouts drained reserves. Maritime stock prices dipped. Investors lost confidence in both shipping technology and human judgment. The same newspapers that once hailed ships as metaphors for progress now treated them as metaphors for hubris. You could argue that the Titanic marked the moment when modern capitalism got its first real existential mirror. The world realized that innovation without humility is a loaded gun. You see, in the Titanic's era, risk wasn't managed. It was ignored. The ship's builders knew about weaknesses in the hull design, but deadlines and competition made them cut corners. The lifeboats? Only enough for about half the passengers. Why? Because regulations were outdated and everyone assumed the ships of the future couldn't possibly sink. It's the kind of thinking that repeats itself everywhere, from mortgage lending to software security. When profits grow faster than caution, icebergs tend to show up. There's something poetic in how the Titanic's legacy evolved. Insurance companies, governments, and engineers didn't just repair a ship. They rebuilt an entire approach to risk. Modern maritime law, for example, owes much of its rigor to lessons from that night. For the first time, shipping safety wasn't just a technical issue. It became an economic one. Too many people had too much money tied to trust, and that trust had literally gone underwater. But there's a deeper question you might be asking. Why did everyone need to believe in unsinkability in the first place? Because confidence fuels economies. Investors pour money into promising ventures only when they believe in invincibility. The Titanic's fame was built on this psychological gold. People don't just buy products, they buy safety, power, and destiny. And when that illusion cracks, markets shiver. The loss of belief can destroy as much wealth as any physical disaster. Take a step back and notice the emotional pattern. Before the Titanic, the early 20th century was a boom era. After the disaster, fear crept into boardrooms and banks. Suddenly, safety protocols, inspections, and compliance policies exploded across industries. It wasn't just ships being regulated, insurance portfolios, engineering standards, even public communications changed. The Titanic forced governments to take responsibility where private ambition had failed. It turned arrogance into legislation. And yet, as humans, we have short memories. Every generation builds its own Titanic. The microchip bubble, the housing market frenzy, the cryptomania. Each time, we tell ourselves that technology or data or new rules make us immune from collapse. But the ocean doesn't forget. It always finds a way to remind us that confidence is not a substitute for control. The Titanic syndrome, as we might call it, is the repeating cycle of belief, overreach, collapse, and reform that defines economic history. Now, let's dig a little deeper into how this disaster reshaped the idea of financial safety. Lloyd's of London, the powerhouse of maritime insurance, handled massive claims after the sinking. That forced them to rethink how they priced risk. They started accounting for human error, meteorological unpredictability, and structural flaws, not just the ship's cargo. In other words, they began to quantify uncertainty, turning tragedy into mathematics. That shift gave rise to the modern insurance model still used today. It's ironic, isn't it? Out of one of history's worst maritime disasters came the blueprint for one of the most stable sectors in modern finance. But it came at the cost of more than 1,000 lives and millions of pounds. It's a brutal reminder that progress rarely moves forward without casualties. And from that moment on, the maritime industry learned that optimism without accountability is just gambling with higher stakes. However, the Titanic also revealed something more subtle: how storytelling sustains economies. Newspapers and telegraphs spread the tragedy worldwide. Public fascination with the ship's opulence, the heroism, and the horror turned the event into an early example of viral media. That collective trauma created a cultural shift, a humbler tone in business discourse, a realization that perfection isn't profit, and that the world runs on fallible humans, not mechanical gods. But here's a twist you might not expect. The Titanic also accelerated the democratization of travel. As safety regulations increased and technology improved, the industry actually opened to more passengers. In a strange way, the disaster made the sea safer for everyone, not just the rich. The lesson cost dearly, but it forced inclusion and rigor. You could call it the paradox of progress. It often takes a fall to make the next leap safer. By the 1930s, you could already see the long-term impact. Shipping became more standardized, shipyards adopted quality control, and governments established international safety conventions. People finally understood that efficiency needed to coexist with redundancy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sustainable. And that's a theme we keep revisiting across centuries. When greed drives innovation faster than oversight, the iceberg always wins. Now let's connect this to mindset. The Titanic syndrome isn't just about ships. It's about how humans handle complexity. Whether it's a financial system or a logistics network, our tendency is to focus on the glitter while ignoring the cracks. We reward success stories and dismiss doomsayers. Until the crash. Then, suddenly, everyone pretends to have seen it coming. It's the oldest story in capitalism, and one we seem doomed to repeat forever. What makes this syndrome dangerous is how invisible it feels. The crew of the Titanic didn't believe they were being reckless. They believed they were living in a new age of reliability. That's how bubbles are born, through collective delusion dressed as confidence. The smarter people feel, the dumber their mistakes become. You could even say the real iceberg was human pride floating just below the surface of prosperity. One curious fact that always gets overlooked is how markets distribute memory unevenly. The Titanic was a British tragedy, but its financial aftershocks were global. American banks lost financing connections. European insurers revised models, and colonial routes adjusted freight expectations. For a world that prided itself on mastery of time and distance, the Titanic proved that still had the final say. All it took was one iceberg to humble an empire. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? The Titanic wasn't just a warning about ships, it was a premonition about systems. Every industry eventually builds its own Titanic. A symbol of success so massive, so confident, that no one dares to question it until it's too late. When an economy stops asking, "What if?" it's already charting a course toward its own iceberg. The trick isn't avoiding ambition, it's steering it with realism. Next time someone tells you something is too safe to fail, remember that arrogance is the most expensive insurance policy on Earth. The Titanic taught us that progress without balance becomes decay. Because once you stop preparing for storms, you're already sinking. just waiting for the water to reach your deck. Let's start with a simple question. When you pick up your phone, do you ever stop to think about where it actually came from? Not where you bought it, but where all its parts were born. The screen might come from South Korea, the battery from China, the microchips from Taiwan, and the software from California. Before it even lands in your pocket, that single device has traveled through dozens of ports, factories, and currencies. That invisible journey is what we call the global supply chain, and it's what keeps the modern world spinning, literally. But here's the catch. Almost no one sees it. You don't see the ships carrying lithium, or the containers stacked like Lego blocks crossing the oceans. You just see the final result. A smooth, shiny product that arrives 2 days after you click the Buy Now button. That's the magic trick of globalization. It hides complexity behind convenience, and as long as it works, nobody questions it. The problem begins when something goes wrong, like a stuck ship, a pandemic, or suddenly, war. Global trade, in theory, sounds logical. Every country does what's best at, and everyone wins. Economists call this comparative advantage. It means if Brazil produces coffee efficiently and Japan builds cars efficiently, both can trade and become richer. Sounds perfect, right? The issue is that over the decades, efficiency replaced resilience. Businesses stopped asking, "Is this safe?" and started asking, "Is this cheaper?" And that question has shaped the fate of every economy in the 21st century. Let's take a specific example. A single car today has about 30,000 parts. Those parts can come from 20 or more different countries. Some factories don't keep large inventories anymore because storage costs money. Instead, they rely on that just-in-time delivery system, the same one that completely collapsed during the Suez Canal blockage. One missing part, even something as small as a screw, can freeze production worth millions per day. That's how tight the margins are in a globalized economy. You might think this level of interconnection makes everything stronger. Paradoxically, it makes everything weaker. A delay in Malaysia can close a plant in Mexico. A drought in Argentina can raise the price of bread in France. A cyber attack in Singapore can slow down ports in Rotterdam. Globalization turned trade into a tightly wound thread that connects everything. So much that a small vibration in one end can rattle the entire system. Now the real question is, why do we keep building such fragile chains? The answer lies in incentives. Corporations are rewarded for efficiency and cost saving, not for redundancy. Investors love quarterly profits, not safety margins. Governments celebrate GDP growth, not resilience indexes. So everyone optimizes the system to work faster, cheaper, and leaner, until it finally breaks. Then they pretend it was unforeseeable, when in fact, it was inevitable. There's a term used by economists called externalities. It means the hidden costs of an activity that someone else ends up paying. When you order a new laptop, the externalities include the fuel burned, the carbon emitted, and the wasted time when shipments delay. But we ignore those costs because they're not on the invoice. That's the invisible part of the invisible chain, the one we don't see, but always pay for eventually in inflation, pollution, or lost jobs. Now let's demystify something important. International trade isn't just about goods. It's also about information and money moving across borders. Every payment for those container shipments requires financial institutions, insurance, currency exchanges, and digital contracts. A hiccup in any link, say sanctions or cyber issues, can freeze the entire operation. Trade is no longer just physical cargo. It's digital, financial, and psychological. That makes it faster, but also way more fragile. Think about how much pressure we've put on logistics technology. Automated ports, predictive shipping routes, AI inventory systems, all designed to make sure that nothing ever stops. But as we learned with the Ever Given, Even the most advanced software can't predict human error or mother's mood swings. Each advancement in automation brings new efficiency, but also removes human flexibility. When something breaks, there's less room to improvise. The machine can't panic, but it also can't adapt. Let's get really specific with this. Supply chains are like arteries, and money is their blood. When something clogs, the system doesn't just slow. It can suffer a full-blown heart attack. We saw this during the pandemic, when factories closed and container prices skyrocketed. Suddenly, it cost 10 times more to ship a product across oceans. For the first time, people realized that those low prices in their online cart existed thanks to an extremely delicate infrastructure they never thought about. So who controls these chains? It's not governments, as you might think. It's a mix of giant corporations, shipping alliances, and logistics networks spanning continents. The top 10 shipping companies control about 80% of maritime trade. That's not competition. It's concentration. And when so few players dominate the game, they can tilt it however they like. That's why during crises, you often hear about record profits for shippers, even as consumers face shortages. Let's take a short pause and connect this to you. Remember the last time you saw an item out of stock online? Or when gas prices suddenly jumped overnight? Those tiny personal frustrations are echoes of massive trade disruptions. When the world optimizes for cost, it transfers volatility to consumers. You pay less when things go right, but pay double when they go wrong. That's the hidden fine print of globalization. Efficiency benefits corporations, while vulnerability punishes the individual. One of the wildest details about modern supply chains is how much they rely on predictability. Every single route, factory schedule, and delivery window is built assuming tomorrow will be like today. But when an event shatters that assumption, like a ship blocking a canal or a war closing a port, confidence collapses. Suddenly, prices stop reflecting reality. They reflect panic. And panic spreads faster than cargo. This leads us to another important concept: supply elasticity. Sounds fancy, right? In plain terms, it's about how easily the system can stretch when demand suddenly increases or contracts. A flexible supply chain can bounce back. A rigid one cracks. Right now, global trade is full of rigidity. That's why one small issue can cascade into months of delay. It's not one broken link. It's a frozen network pretending everything's fine until it's not. Another aspect often missed is how dependent countries are on maritime routes. Roughly 9 out of every 10 goods you use travel by sea at some point. That makes choke points like the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and the Strait of Malacca modern economic pressure points. Control those, and you control prices, power, and politics. For nations, protecting these routes isn't just about navy strength, it's about survival. In a way, the ocean is the real stock exchange of the world. What's fascinating is how this invisible system has made geography relevant again. For years, globalization was supposed to erase borders, making the world flat and frictionless. But the moment something goes wrong, geography bites back. Distance, climate, and terrain still decide who suffers most when trade freezes. The Ever Given proved that even in the digital age, physical reality still has veto power over human ambition. So, let's make this personal for a second. Picture your own life. Your clothes, your food, your phone, your car. Almost everything that defines your comfort depends on cooperation between countries you've never visited and people you'll never meet. That's beautiful, but also terrifying. Because what happens when that cooperation breaks down? What happens when politics, greed, or decide not to play along anymore? The invisible chain becomes visible the moment it snaps. Another term worth knowing here is bullwhip effect. Imagine flicking a whip. The handle moves slightly, but the tip moves wildly. That's what happens in supply chains. A small change in consumer demand at one end can create massive fluctuations in production at the other. During lockdowns, everyone started buying home electronics. Factories ramped up production. Then demand cooled, and now warehouses are full of unsold goods. The chain overreacted, swinging from scarcity to surplus like a pendulum. Here's something most people don't realize. Global trade isn't only about moving goods, it's about trust. Every shipment assumes that payment will arrive, that customs will cooperate, that contracts will be honored. That trust is fragile, and once it breaks, everything slows. Think about a friend who owes you money. If they delay too often, you stop lending. The same happens between nations. Trade is just structured trust, and crises demolish it fast. We also can't ignore the role of digitalization here. Blockchain, tracking sensors, and real-time data promise to make logistics transparent and efficient. But these tools don't eliminate risks, they just measure them faster. Knowing there's a delay doesn't fix the delay. Data helps visibility, not invincibility. Global trade might be smarter today, but it's not safer. It's like adding GPS to a car that still doesn't have brakes. Now let's wrap something around this idea. The more we depend on invisible chains, the more their weaknesses become existential. Governments are beginning to treat logistics like national security. There's talk about reshoring production, bringing factories back home. Sounds logical, but it's expensive. Consumers love low prices, and low prices demand global supply chains. It's a tug of war between convenience and sovereignty, and right now, convenience is still winning. So next time you order something online and get that instant confirmation, remember the journey your purchase takes. A journey across oceans, bureaucracies, storms, and spreadsheets. You're not just buying a product, you're buying into a fragile miracle of coordination that can collapse at any moment. The invisible chains of global trade are strong enough to lift the world, but weak enough to strangle it when pulled too tight. And that, my friend, is the real paradox. The more seamless our world feels, the more fragile it actually is. We have built a civilization so efficient that it's allergic to friction. But as every great crisis proves, resilience is never free. It's paid for in redundancy, time, and humility. 3 things the global market tends to undervalue. The invisible chains of trade don't just move goods, they move our fates. You may not see them, but you're definitely attached to them. Picture this for a second. A ship leaves port filled with containers worth hundreds of millions. The crew might be in charge of navigating the ocean, but the real power, the one that decides whether that ship even sails, is sitting inside an office in London, Singapore, or New York. It's not the captain, it's the insurer. In the age of global trade, these people with spreadsheets and risk models have quietly become the true captains of the seas. They control not where ships go, but whether they go at all. Maritime insurance sounds boring, right? It's anything but. Imagine betting daily on billions of dollars floating across unpredictable oceans. Every ship, every container, every shipment of oil or grain is covered by insurance policies that decide who takes the hit if something goes wrong. That system, developed centuries ago in coffeehouses like Lloyd's of London, remains one of the oldest financial safety nets still functioning today. Without it, global trade simply wouldn't exist. Let's rewind to where it all began. In the 17th century, merchants faced brutal risks. Storms, pirates, wars, you name it. Ships vanished all the time, leaving fortunes at the bottom of the sea. To spread the risk, traders started pooling money together, creating a collective safety net. If one ship sank, everyone chipped in to help the owner recover. That's the earliest model of insurance, and for better or worse, it hasn't changed much. It's capitalism's way of saying, we know chaos will come, but let's profit from it. Now here's the key to understanding how massive this market is. Every ship must have multiple layers of coverage. Hull insurance for the vessel itself, protection and indemnity for liabilities like pollution or crew injury, and cargo insurance covering everything inside. These layers create an ecosystem worth trillions. And inside that ecosystem, insurers don't just react to accidents. They shape the very design, route, and rhythm of global trade. In other words, they are the invisible captains navigating economies from behind a desk. You might be wondering how they decide what something is worth. That's where risk modeling enters the chat. These insurers use history, probabilities, and increasingly artificial intelligence to forecast damage and loss. They analyze weather patterns, geopolitical events, and even shipping lane congestion to adjust premiums. A war in the Red Sea? Premiums spike overnight. A new type of stronger hull gets introduced? Premiums drop. This financial choreography keeps the modern ocean economy running smoother than most realize. But here's where it gets tricky. Insurance doesn't eliminate risk. It redistributes it. When an accident happens, someone must pay, and that someone is often not who you expect. After the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal, insurers around the world were scrambling to evaluate liability. Was it the ship owner's fault? The canal authorities? The weathers? Millions in claims depended on that answer, and the debate dragged on for months. In the meantime, ports raised premiums, shipping companies changed routes, and new safety clauses got added to contracts. The financial echoes of one crash outlived the physical one. And that's the part nobody tells you. Insurance isn't just a safety cushion, it's an economic steering wheel. By deciding which risks are acceptable and which aren't, insurers indirectly tell shipbuilders what to design, carriers where to travel, and exporters how to trade. If insurers refuse to cover cargo in a specific region, say because of piracy or sanctions, trade stops instantly. No company dares to send a vessel into uninsurable waters. In a way, a few financial institutions dictate global logistics as much as governments or armies. Think about that power. The modern economy worships risk-taking, but it quietly depends on a handful of firms that monetize fear. These institutions don't care whether a ship carries sneakers, oil, or smartphones. All that matters is the ratio between potential loss and premium income. Human risk transforms into mathematical data, and oceans into spreadsheets. The people at sea might navigate waves, but the real storms brew in financial offices thousands of miles away. Let's take an example from history to make it clearer. In the 18th century, insurers influenced colonial expansion. When European empires wanted to exploit new territories, insurers had to evaluate the safety of those voyages. The more certain profits seemed, the easier it was to secure funding. Insurance became the oxygen of exploration, fueling ships, merchants, and armies. Without it, many imperial expeditions wouldn't have happened. The global economy was literally underwritten by fear and greed. Fast forward to today, and little has changed. Multinational insurers still grease the gears of globalization. If a port city is deemed politically unstable, costs skyrocket. If environmental regulations get tougher, claims increase. And when major disasters strike, like hurricanes, oil spills, or even supply chain bottlenecks, insurers quietly adjust incentives, nudging the logistics world into safer waters. They're like referees who don't play the game, but decide who's allowed on the field. What most people overlook is that insurance isn't just reactive, it's predictive. By watching where money moves in the insurance market, you can actually anticipate the next bottleneck or crisis. For example, spikes in maritime premiums often signal growing unrest or environmental strain in particular regions. The stock market reacts after events. The insurance market reacts before them. In that sense, insurers might understand the state of global stability better than the politicians who run it. There's also a moral angle here that's worth exploring. When disaster strikes, the question isn't who gets saved, it's who gets paid. After shipwrecks, insurers assess value, not lives. A shipment of luxury goods might be covered for millions, while the human loss on board gets a modest payout. That imbalance reveals an uncomfortable truth about capitalist priorities. The economic system values cargo more than people, not because of cruelty, but because that's how contracts are written. Money doesn't mourn, it calculates. When you think about it, the idea of assured cargo is one of the strangest inventions in human history. It's a promise to pay for something that doesn't yet exist, for conditions that no one can predict. Essentially, insurance turns uncertainty into something tradable. You can even buy and sell policies like stocks. This liquidity of fear helped the rise of global commerce, but it also made speculation part of everyday business. The line between managing risk and gambling on catastrophe became very thin. Let's not forget the role of reinsurance. In simple terms, it's when insurers insure themselves. No, that's not a joke. Because the risks are so massive, primary insurers pass part of the burden to bigger ones. That's why a port explosion in Lebanon or a typhoon in the Philippines can financially shake companies in Zurich or Bermuda. The same few giants essentially own slices of almost every major shipping policy on Earth. So while physical trade is globalized, so is its financial skeleton. Economic globalization is built on reinsured paranoia. You might be thinking, this all sounds detached from daily reality. But in truth, these financial structures decide the price tag on everything you own. Think of insurance as the ghost tax embedded in every purchase. When premiums rise, transport costs rise. When transport costs rise, goods get more expensive. Inflation, in part, travels through the sea in insured containers. You're not just paying for the product. You're paying for the collective anxiety that the product might never reach you. There's also a fascinating feedback loop between shipping efficiency and insurance. The safer and more technologically advanced ships become, the lower premiums fall. That pushes companies to innovate faster to reduce costs. But as ships grow larger and more complex, accidents become rarer but far more expensive when they occur. The system saves pennies on small risks but loses billions on big ones. It's the insurance equivalent of trading frequent small storms for a once-in-a-century hurricane. And when those hurricanes arrive, metaphorical or literal, the ripples spread globally. Ports halt operations. Commodity prices spike. Investors panic. All because the risk models can't predict chaos perfectly. This is where human emotion crashes into mathematical logic. After a massive disaster, premiums skyrocket out of fear, even if the statistical risk hasn't changed much. That's how markets create self-fulfilling crises. Fear inflates the cost of safety until safety becomes unaffordable. It's tempting to see insurers as villains, pulling strings from behind the scenes. But that's not quite accurate. They're more like risk translators. Their job is to quantify chaos in ways that make trade possible. Without them, no ship would sail, no cargo would move, no economy would function. The problem appears when their cold rationality meets human overconfidence. Captains trust steel. Insurers trust numbers. Both forget how random the sea really is. Now let's dig into how this ties back to the fragility theme. When insurance turns every risk into an economic variable, it gives the illusion that everything is controllable. But not everything is. You can insure against damage, but not against disruption. You can pay for loss, but not for time. That's what the Ever Given reminded us. Even when money covers the damage, lost time can never be refunded. Insurance can rebuild ships, but it can't unfreeze trade. So if insurers are the real captains, what should we learn from their maps? Maybe that risk isn't the enemy. It's part of the ocean itself. The goal isn't to eliminate it, but to navigate it wisely. The tragedy is that our system often learns only after the crash. Each crisis recalibrates premiums, reshuffles routes, and rewrites contracts, but forgets the emotional lesson about limits. It's a cycle as old as trade itself. Underestimate, overprice confidence, and then start over with new paperwork. The next time you picture a giant container ship moving across the sea, imagine not just the sailors on deck, but also the invisible hands of financiers watching from skyscraper windows. They're the ones steering through abstract storms, the tempests of liability, speculation, and global trust. In the end, commerce doesn't sail on wind or diesel. It sails on belief, the belief that when something breaks, someone will pay. That belief is so powerful that it has become the backbone of the modern economy. And that's the paradox at the heart of global trade. Insurance gives us the courage to take risks, but also blinds us to the true cost of risk itself. It makes us braver, richer, and more reckless at the same time. Because when you know you're covered, you push the limits further. That logic built empires, launched ships, and now drives automation and finance. But as history keeps showing, the sea always collects its debt, sometimes from the ship, sometimes from the banker, and sometimes from all of us. Now that we've seen both the Titanic and the Evergreen from their own angles, let's put them on the same map. At first glance, they couldn't be more different. The Titanic was a symbol of early industrial arrogance, built in an age of steel and steam, when progress felt unstoppable. The Evergreen, on the other hand, belongs to the digital age, an icon of global efficiency, data, and algorithms. Yet both ended up in the same place, stuck, broken, and remembered as warnings rather than triumphs. You see, these two ships are like bookends to the story of modern economic ambition. The Titanic showed us what happens when overconfidence meets. The Evergreen showed us what happens when optimization meets chaos. Separated by more than a century, they represent the same flaw dressed in different technology. Human pride doesn't evolve as fast as our machines do. That's why history feels like déjà vu with bigger ships. Let's start with scale, because that's the first obvious link. In 1912, the Titanic was the largest moving object ever built by humans. In 2021, the Evergreen was one of the largest container ships ever constructed. Both were celebrated as monuments of progress, proof that humans could engineer their way through anything. But both failed spectacularly, not because of design flaws, but because of systemic blindness, a refusal to consider what could go wrong. In the Titanic's time, the problem was overconfidence in technology. People believed steel hulls and watertight compartments made the ship unsinkable. In the Evergreen's world, the problem was overconfidence in automation and logistics. Satellite-guided routes, real-time data, and predictive analytics gave an illusion of total control. Yet both vessels fell victim to the one variable no one can dominate: randomness. Doesn't read spreadsheets or marketing slogans. What's almost poetic here is how the same story repeats under different masks. The Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg at night. The Evergreen got stuck because of strong winds and poor visibility in the Suez Canal. In both cases, minor misjudgments under pressure turned billion-dollar marvels into cautionary tales. The difference is that while the Titanic cost lives, the Evergreen cost time, and in today's economy, time is the new currency. Consider the impact metrics. The Titanic's sinking triggered massive public outrage, new regulations, and a lasting cultural wound. The Evergreen didn't kill anyone, but it froze nearly 15% of global trade, affecting billions of dollars in lost revenue daily. Different kinds of pain, same underlying fragility. Both revealed that our systems are so optimized that they break when touched. It's the economic version of glass, crystal clear, dazzling, and outrageously fragile. One could argue that the Titanic's disaster was emotional, while the Evergreen's was logistical. But both had deep psychological effects. The Titanic shattered faith in invincibility at the height of the industrial age. The Evergreen shattered faith in efficiency at the height of globalization. Each marked the moment when people collectively realized that perfection is just a pause between failures. The world keeps mistaking control for stability. Think about the value systems behind both ships. The Titanic represented luxury and class hierarchy. First-class passengers dined under chandeliers while lower decks worked unseen. The Ever Given represented productivity and speed. Containers stacked endlessly to maximize space and profit. Different centuries, same obsession. Doing more, faster, with less margin for error. When you strip away the steel and the software, both are built on the same mantra: growth without pause. Now, let's talk about their economic echoes. The Titanic's sinking sparked a wave of insurance reform and safety protocols that reshaped shipping forever. The Ever Given's blockage triggered re-evaluation of supply chain strategies, pushing countries to rethink dependency on single trade routes. But do you notice the pattern? Each catastrophe made us redesign the rules only after disaster struck. Our learning curve always follows tragedy. It never precedes it. There's also an irony hidden in timing. In the early 20th century, the Titanic symbolized the dawn of global mobility. It was built to move people toward opportunity. In the 21st century, the Ever Given symbolized the peak of global interdependence. It was built to move goods to sustain opportunity. One marked globalization's birth, the other, its midlife crisis. Both events bookend eras where humanity figured out that bigger doesn't necessarily mean better. Take a step back and imagine both ships as metaphors for their economies. The Titanic's route from Europe to America mirrored the optimism of industrial capitalism. Expansion, empire, and endless growth. The Ever Given's route through the Suez mirrored the efficiency cult of late capitalism, complex, compressed, and fragile. In both, the ship becomes a symbol of its time. Mighty, admired, and utterly dependent on everything going right. Here's something worth noting. Neither ship failed because of sabotage or malice. They failed because they were designed too perfectly for perfect conditions. The Titanic assumed calm waters. The Ever Given assumed clear channels. Both designs ignored chaos, and that ignorance was expensive. It's the same with global systems today. We design economies as though volatility were optional. Then act surprised when a storm shows up. Another striking similarity is how their crises exposed power dynamics. When the Titanic sank, the headlines focused on the wealthy who lost their lives, not the hundreds of working-class souls who were never rescued. The Ever Given's headlines focused on billions in global trade losses, not on the seafarers stuck waiting for orders in blistering heat. Different centuries, same blindness toward the human cost behind the economic one. It's also fascinating how both disasters redefined what people feared. After the Titanic, travelers feared the sea. After the Ever Given, governments feared disruption. You can survive a storm, but can you survive a market freeze? The modern economy fears inactivity more than loss. Productivity has replaced safety as the ultimate goal. That's why a single ship can halt the rhythm of countries without sinking a single hull. Let's also address one key distinction: the medium of panic. The Titanic's tragedy was broadcast via telegrams and newspapers, spreading slowly, painfully. The Ever Given's crisis unfolded in real time on social media, where every meme, photo, and tweet amplified the absurdity of a ship stuck sideways. People watched economics turn into comedy. In both eras, mass communication transformed maritime accidents into global theater, but the emotional tone changed, from mourning to mockery. Now let's talk money. The Titanic cost about $7.5 million to build in its time, which would be hundreds of millions today. The Ever Given, worth well over $1 billion, froze around $60 billion in global trade during the blockage. Both numbers remind us that ambition has always carried an outrageous price tag. The difference is that in the industrial age, losses were localized. In the global age, they're shared. The Titanic sank one company. The Ever Given shook the entire planet. Isn't it wild how progress amplifies consequence? A mistake in 1912 affected passengers and shareholders. A mistake in 2021 affected consumers, factories, and stock prices worldwide. It's proof that globalization didn't spread stability. It just spread exposure. The more connected we become, the easier it is for small disruptions to travel at the speed of finance. But maybe the most subtle similarity is philosophical. Both disasters taught humanity the same moral: humility. The Titanic humbled industrial arrogance. The Evergreen humbled digital arrogance. Each forced us to confront the limits of human control. Every time we've mastered unpredictability, the universe throws a floating metaphor right back at us. The pattern is cosmic in scale. The sea always wins. Let's not overlook how leadership responded. After the Titanic, governments formed the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, a global framework for maritime safety. After the Evergreen, we saw press conferences, lawsuits, and tweets about diversifying supply chains. Notice the difference? One era responded with institutions, the other responded with hashtags. Perhaps that reveals the growing superficiality of how we manage disasters in an overstimulated world. And yet, amid the cynicism, both crises left something valuable behind: awareness. After the Titanic, people finally understood that safety couldn't be assumed. After the Evergreen, companies started realizing that supply chains weren't immortal. Awareness may not prevent mistakes, but it prepares minds. The trick is not losing that awareness once the headlines fade, which unfortunately happens almost every time. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine if both captains, Smith of the Titanic and Khan of the Evergreen, met in a timeless pub somewhere outside of history. What would they say to each other? Probably something like, "We both learned too late that the ocean doesn't negotiate." It's an unfair teacher. It charges tuition up front and gives lessons afterward. Both men were symbols of their era's faith in systems that couldn't fail until they did. Now, how do we fit into this story? Because, like it or not, we're passengers on the new Titanic and crew on the new Evergreen. Our economies are the ships now. Massive, interlinked, and sailing faster than caution allows. Every financial algorithm is a watertight door. Every trade route is a canal waiting to be blocked. The question isn't whether something will fail, it's when and how hard the impact will be. If there's one bridge between these two disasters, it's that both were predictable in hindsight. That's the cruel genius of complex systems. They look stable until you zoom in. Then you see the cracks everywhere. The Titanic's lifeboats, too few and decorative. The Evergreen's routes, too narrow and overbooked. Global economies often follow the same flawed blueprint, prioritizing aesthetics and profit over resilience and margin. So, when we place the Titanic and the Evergreen side by side, we're not just comparing accidents, we're comparing attitudes. Both ships were built on the belief that control equals security. Both prove the opposite. The bigger the system, the smaller its tolerance for error. And as technology makes our economies faster and more connected, that tolerance keeps shrinking. The sea of global trade is calmer on the surface, but far stormier underneath. In the end, both ships left invisible legacies. The Titanic taught us to respect risk in a mechanical world. The Evergreen taught us to respect complexity in a digital one. But both stories share the same conclusion. Fragility hides inside success. The greater our ambition, the thinner the ice beneath it. And until we learn to balance growth with humility, we'll keep building new Titanics, only to watch them drift helplessly into the next iceberg, or sandbank, in our endless chase for efficiency. Let's stop for a moment and breathe, because after all this talk of sinking ships and global breakdowns, there's one big question left waiting at the bottom of the ocean. What now? When the Evergreen got stuck and the Titanic went down, both left behind lessons written not in water, but in economics and psychology. These weren't just accidents. They were mirrors showing how fragile our systems and our confidence really are. The trick is learning from them before the next wave hits. You can think of both disasters as case studies in arrogance, not personal arrogance, but systemic arrogance, the kind that comes from believing we've finally outsmarted unpredictability. The Titanic era believed in invincibility. The Evergreen era believed in efficiency. Both forgot balance. And balance, inconvenient as it may sound, is the underrated ingredient of survival, whether in ships, economies, or entire civilizations. So, let's anchor this discussion around one simple truth. Fragility hides in success. When everything seems to be working perfectly, that's usually the moment when cracks start forming beneath the surface. The global economy runs on intricate networks that depend on perfect timing, perfect trust, and perfect weather. But perfect is temporary. What the ocean keeps teaching us is that the measure of strength isn't speed or size. It's resilience. Resilience is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it really mean in economic terms? It means having backup plans. It means tolerating inefficiency to avoid collapse. It's the willingness to pay a little more today to survive tomorrow. And here's the uncomfortable part. Resilience costs money. So most companies, and even governments, ignore it until disaster forces their hand. Think of how we structure supply chains, investments, even entire cities. Everything is optimized for the best-case scenario. The result? Systems so tight and interconnected that one failure triggers a chain of pain spreading worldwide. The Titanic had too few lifeboats because designers prioritized aesthetics over safety. The Evergreen had too much cargo because companies prioritized space over maneuverability. In both cases, design choices aimed for profit and gambled on perfection. But here's something less discussed: the emotional dimension of trade. Confidence is currency. When confidence grows unchecked, it inflates bubbles in markets, technology, and even logistics. After every major crisis, from ships to stocks, the hardest hit isn't just financial, it's psychological. People lose faith. Ports get cautious. Investors hesitate. And recovery depends as much on rebuilding belief as on fixing infrastructure. Still, history shows that we do learn, at least for a while. The Titanic rewrote global maritime law, forcing the creation of international safety standards. The Evergreen reignited conversations about diversification and regional manufacturing. But creating new rules isn't enough if the mindset stays unchanged. The real lesson isn't to patch the hole, it's to stop steering toward it in the first place. Let's take resilience seriously. Imagine if global trade was designed with the same care we reserve for emergency systems: redundant routes, flexible logistics, and realistic insurance assessments. What would happen if corporations accepted short-term profits for long-term stability? It doesn't sound exciting, but that's precisely what keeps societies safe. Economies should act more like ecosystems, adaptable, diverse, and self-healing, rather than machines that jam when one gear snaps. Now, here's a philosophical twist. Both the Titanic and the Evergreen taught us that progress always comes with fragility. The more advanced we become, the more dependent we grow on the systems we create. A medieval fisherman didn't need to worry about a microchip shortage or a blocked canal. But in today's world, a cargo delay in one port can cause layoffs thousands of miles away. Progress multiplies connections. Connections multiply vulnerability. We like to think control and complexity are the same thing. They're not. Complexity without control is chaos in fancy disguise. Look at financial systems, shipping networks, or digital infrastructure. They all work until something unplanned happens. Then the dominoes fall. No one plans for dominoes because no one profits from them. That's why crises keep catching us by surprise. They reveal the parts of reality no spreadsheet can model. But here's the hopeful side. Every time we face collapse, we also face clarity. The Titanic made humanity humble enough to value safety. The Evergreen made governments aware of how fragile globalization truly is. These moments strip illusions away. They remind us that our economies are only as strong as our capacity to adapt. And adaptation requires curiosity, creativity, and above all, humility. It's tempting to blame individuals, the captain, the manager, the engineer, but the truth is systemic. Both disasters came from collective overconfidence. Everyone did their job correctly within a flawed design. That's the scary part. Failure doesn't always come from bad people making mistakes. It often comes from good people doing exactly what their incentives tell them to do. And the systems we've built reward risk, not reflection. So how do we flip the script? Start by redefining success. Instead of measuring economies by how fast they grow, maybe we should measure them by how well they endure shocks. Instead of applauding efficiency, we should celebrate adaptability. A resilient system might look slower, but it can survive storms without capsizing. In finance, we call this anti-fragility. The concept that the best systems don't just resist shocks, they grow stronger because of them. That idea might sound abstract, but think of forests burn and regrow. Oceans rage and calm. Adaptation is built into life itself. Our economies, however, often fight this principle, insisting on endless control. The irony is that by chasing stability, we make ourselves unstable. Every safety shortcut we take, every redundancy we remove, makes the next collapse more dramatic. Mother doesn't forgive hubris, whether it's steel ships or shipping routes. Let's bring this down to your level. How does all this affect the average person? Simple. The same patterns that break global systems also hurt personal ones. Living paycheck to paycheck? That's a personal version of a fragile supply chain. Borrowing without saving? That's an optimization trap. Efficient until one shock ruins everything. The lesson from the depths is universal. Leave room for error, build buffers, and accept discomfort today to prevent disaster tomorrow. Another layer of this story is moral. The Titanic and the Evergreen showed who pays when things fall apart. In both cases, ordinary workers bore the brunt. Crew members, factory workers, small business owners. The rich may lose money, but the poor lose stability. That's an uncomfortable truth about every crisis. Risk is shared unequally. Those at the top control decisions. Those at the bottom absorb the consequences. Yet even that pattern contains an opportunity. Awareness creates accountability. The more people understand systems, the harder it becomes to ignore their flaws. When you know what fragile looks like, you start demanding better. The public pressure after the Titanic changed laws. The outrage after the Evergreen sparked debate on infrastructure reform. Knowledge may not stop the next iceberg, but it can make sure the ship is built with more lifeboats. Now, let's step back and think big picture again. Humanity keeps repeating the same cycle: innovation, expansion, crisis, regulation, complacency. Then it all starts again. Progress seems to come in waves, no pun intended. What separates thriving societies from collapsing ones is how they ride those waves. The ones that survive see crises as course corrections, not curses. They learn, adapt, and steer smarter next time. The ocean has always been our teacher in that sense. It rewards patience and punishes arrogance. Every sailor knows that you don't fight the sea, you navigate it. The same rule applies to economies. Instead of trying to dominate complexity, we should learn to flow with it. Flexibility beats control. Curiosity beats certainty. And humility beats hubris every single time. There's a phrase economists love: systemic risk. It means that when one part of a system fails, the rest follows. But systemic risk is not destiny. It's design. If we whittle resilience down to zero, then naturally, one mistake sinks everything. The Titanic and the Evergreen are reminders that our modern systems aren't doomed. They're just poorly designed for reality. We have the blueprint. We just need the will. So as we wrap up this journey from the depths, let's bring it home. Every crisis leaves two paths. The first is denial, pretending the storm has passed and everything can go back to normal. The second is awareness, realizing that the storm exposed truths we've ignored for too long. Which path we take will decide the future not only of economies, but of how we define progress itself. If there's one final lesson to take from the Titanic and the Ever Given, it's this: scale doesn't equal strength. Big ships, big systems, big ambitions, they all crumble if built on fragile assumptions. True strength lies in adaptability, not magnitude. The ocean doesn't favor size, it favors balance. The sooner we learn that, the fewer times we'll need to rebuild after the next metaphorical iceberg. So next time you hear about a new big thing, a faster supply chain, a larger port, an even bolder ambition, pause and ask one question: what happens if it breaks? Because planning for what can go wrong isn't pessimism, it's maturity. And maturity, more than technology, is what keeps both ships and societies afloat. Now it's your turn to decide: will we build the future as captains who respect the sea? Or passengers crossing their fingers, hoping it stays calm?